Oh, well, hello there. My name's Mark. I'm the host of this channel, Spectrum Pulse, and today we're going to be exploring a couple ideas. Because there's this old quote from 19th century English historian Henry Thomas Buckle. I'm going to paraphrase it. The lower class talks about persons, the middle class talks about things, and the upper class talks about ideas. Now, it should be known that this historian lived off an inheritance and never worked a proper day in his life, but hey, why should I bring that up at all? Don't you want to be high class? Don't you want to have good taste? Don't you want to be cool? Because today we're going to be exploring some of those ideas in the context of Justin Timberlake's comeback release in 2013, the 2020 Experience. It's not really a review. I've already covered the album about a decade ago, but in the context of the era, this was a conversation that we really didn't have as much as we probably should have. Now, this will be the first of 3 videos around some of these ideas this year, and we're going to try to keep this pretty chill, but should you need to step out and refresh your drink or spark out, the exits, they're on the far left. Hey, if you know, you know. So welcome everyone to Class Warfare in 2013.
Let me show you a few things. Show you a few things about love. Hey.
Part 1. Disclaimers. Alright, let's get this out of the way quickly. Folks really do not like the term class warfare, especially Americans who have dreamed their way into believing that if you can make it there, you can make it anywhere. Challenging that dream, or exposing it for the existential waking nightmare that it can become, it isn't just an attack on the fundamental values and beliefs of conservatives, damn near a religion, but it's considered divisive or being a poor sport for your average liberal or Democrat. And I really don't give a shit. It's an incendiary little title for some incendiary topics that have often not been as well examined as they probably should have been, even if by the end of this video, you're not sure what side you're on, or if there's even a side to be taken. And that's a key component of this conversation. How can one be an active part of class warfare if they're not really making art on the surface about class divisions or struggles, or have declared anything about class at all? Why are you making this all about politics anyways? Can't you just shut the fuck up and enjoy the music? And this takes us neatly to the second major point. I have placed Justin Timberlake songs on year-end and decade-end lists before. I can recognize and respect the talent, to the point where I'll go out on a limb and say he doesn't have a truly bad album. Yeah, Man of the Woods isn't that good, but it's nowhere near as terrible as it was made out to be in the aftermath of the 2018 Super Bowl. Really, it's kind of stark how much Super Bowls play in as a major factor of Justin Timberlake's story and legacy. And yes, we're gonna have to get into all of that as well. It's gonna be a long-ass video. But what this means is that I'm not here to put Justin Timberlake on a pedestal as he was for damn near 20 years across the 2000s and 2010s. But I'm also not here to drag him to the guillotine either. It's important to be able to like and appreciate media while seeing its flaws and understanding its cultural context. And Justin Timberlake is a more complicated and polarizing figure than many want to admit, especially within pop music retrospectively. But if you're angry that I referenced class warfare in the context of Justin Timberlake, if you think that I'm already being unfair for pulling him into a conversation for which there are acts that are probably more deserving of that scrutiny, especially in 2013, well, again, I want you to sit with some of those emotions as we discuss the work in the context of taste and coolness, and especially in that of class. As he says at a fascinating intersection point that's allowed him to avoid this particular critique for a long-ass time. Hell, in 2013, where there were multiple charting pop hits that directly engaged with class consciousness in their own distinctly flawed ways, even topping the Hot 100, Justin Timberlake was only peripherally pulled into some of that conversation, despite being an A-list artist who pulled out all the stops to be the centerpiece of conversation in 2013 pop culture. In retrospect, that might be more key to his downfall than anything else. But before we get into all that, and again, strap in, it's going to be a long video, we got to talk about how and why Justin Timberlake was a superstar. So in other words, Alright, let's be real. This shouldn't have really worked. Because at the turn of the millennium, the boy band wars had reached their apex, but it was becoming clear that staying pop was not really going to lead to long-term success. Times were changing, and NSYNC beat the Backstreet Boys to the punch with no strings attached in the year 2000, integrating more elements of R&B into their sound, especially in writing and more modern production. Now, the Backstreet Boys would counter later that same year on Black and Blue with Babyface production credits of their own, but also a remix of The Call with the rap duo Clipse done by Chad Hugo and Pharrell Williams, better known as the Neptunes. And they were already in the know in 2000 thanks to rap, but this was their first pop crossover. It would not be their last. The Neptunes sound would break into pop wholesale in their work with Britney Spears, and a proper single from NSYNC directly with Girlfriend off their album Celebrity.
Don't you be my girlfriend? I'll treat you good. I know you hear your friends when they say you should.
Now, it's also worth noting that Backstreet Boys, NSYNC, Britney, all these acts were on Jive Records. The boy band wars were a hollow marketing lie, playing them against each other. TRL wasn't that real. I'm sorry to break your childhoods just now. And yet, while it would be so easy to say that the pop sound irrevocably changed on 9/11 to get darker, lean more towards hip-hop, the narrative, the truth, it's messier than that. NSYNC was falling apart already by early 2001. Justin Timberlake had been pegged as the star of the group from the very beginning, and he wrote and produced about a third of Celebrity, and yet since 1999 he'd been in a very public, very chaste romance with Britney Spears, which of course drove the tabloids absolutely bananas. They met in the Mickey Mouse Club in 1992, but 8 years later they were the it teen celebrity couple, until they broke up in early 2002, and it became a pretty major tabloid scandal when Justin Timberlake revealed that they weren't exactly that chaste when they were living together in 2001, and he was kind of an ass about it in said interviews. Now, Britney around that time mostly kept quiet about it, mostly because she was soon to descend into a tabloid hell far beyond anything that Justin Timberlake would ever experience. I've seen Britney and Kevin chaotic, except for one possible moment referencing it, when she kissed Madonna on stage at the 2003 MTV VMAs. But hell, by that point, it didn't really even matter. In November of 2002, Justin Timberlake released Justified.
You were my sun. You were my earth. You didn't know all the ways I loved you. No.
In the popular consciousness, he had already won. Recorded in a brief 6-week window when NSYNC was reportedly on hiatus, which according to later interviews really pissed off the rest of NSYNC, and with nearly all the production handled by either the Neptunes or the soon-to-be long-term collaborator Timbaland, it was a commercial and critical smash. And with the song Cry Me a River, he apparently may have thrown all the blame on Britney for the relationship failure, where there was even a look-alike cast in the video. And the public ate it up. Britney would respond briefly to this in interviews in early 2003, but it was too little too late. NSYNC was gone. JT had arrived. And he seemed built to be an A-list pop R&B phenomenon in this era. He had a pretty good voice. He could dance pretty well. He had pretty good taste in production, and he was a pretty good songwriter, even writing tracks for other pop stars at the time. We'll get into it. Now, I didn't really care for Justified at the time myself. Going back to it, I still really don't. It's too long, the production's aged weirdly, feels very of its time. The lyrics are not good, but I also get why it worked, even if Justin Timberlake was becoming an industry force to bulldoze it into popular acceptance, including a co-headlining tour with former friend from the Mickey Mouse Club, Christina Aguilera. Also, let's put an end to some lingering gossip going back 20 years for the very few people who still care. There is no proof Christina and Justin dated. They seem like professional friends. I'm not going to speculate further. It's not the point of any of this. But before we get to a very specific incident at a sporting event that would shape Justin Timberlake's career forevermore, let's ask the bigger question. Why did any of this work? If you know anything about the boy bands of the late 90s, even though NSYNC was somehow able to get out of their exploitative deal with the notorious manager and outright monster Lou Pearlman through a series of highly publicized and extremely messy lawsuits, let's be real, boy bands are not built for long-term sustained success. They got maybe a 5-year timeline, max, especially as pop trends evolve fast. Now, Justin Timberlake was pegged as the lead, he was the superstar, but even then there's no guarantees, especially moving from the mostly family-friendly boy band material to something more sexually charged and sensual, dare I even say racy. I mean, there's been far more failures than successes over the decades in that transition. Now, a major factor is that Justin Timberlake was extremely hands-on and talented in his career, but was also extraordinarily well connected with acts that would go on to be the biggest hitmakers of our time. I've already mentioned the Neptunes and Timbaland as the main producers on Justified, but on that project you also include the exceedingly talented R&B veteran Brian McKnight, the rap duo Clipse consisting of Malice and Pusha T, and most notably, Janet Jackson. Not the first connection that Timberlake had to the Jackson family either, and yeah, we're going to get into that too. But what all this indicates is that even early on in his solo run, Justin Timberlake was backed. He was very well managed. He had powerful friends that would only get more powerful as the years would continue. And he had clout, which became a major strength in music that could sound so expensive, but for which he could probably comfortably recoup. I mean, Justified was an album for the winners, and it was an approach that was rooted in the maximalist dominance built off the biggest rap music of the time that was roaring across the charts. Literally a week after Justified came out, Jay-Z dropped the Blueprint 2.
All I need in this life is sin. It's me and my girlfriend. Me and my girlfriend.
An album that's also way too long, has aged poorly, and isn't nearly as good as its predecessor, but hell, he was right back on top after the utter fucking disaster that was his first collab album with R. Kelly, The Best of Both Worlds. Side note, people tend to forget that Jay-Z made 2 entire albums with R. Kelly in the early 2000s when discussing Jay-Z's legacy. I find that very curious. And very telling. Like, you know what, speaking of New York hip-hop in the early 2000s,
Honey in the club, bottle full of bub. Mama, I got what you need if you need to feel a buzz.
50 Cent dropped Get Rich or Die Trying in the early months of 2003, running on the exact same crushing swagger in the marketing, where if you were able to present yourself as enough of a winner, an alpha who could take apart everything in your path, and showcase just enough talent in order to sell it, it worked. The 2000s kind of ran on that sort of machismo. But with Justin Timberlake, it was a little bit more complicated than that. And that means we have to talk about...
And she says, I wish that I could be like the cool kids, 'cause all the cool kids, they seem to fit in.
Alright, so being cool is a little like Fight Club. You don't talk about it, because that makes it real. And that's kind of where we have to start. The fact that I'm even talking about coolness and how it was a factor in the rise of Justin Timberlake, it immediately places me in the category of someone who is emphatically not cool, because I'm producing analysis on something that for those who know and get it, it just is. Or at least it was. We'll come back to that distinction in a little bit. And keep in mind that attempting to quantify what is cool, it's something that marketing professionals base their entire goddamn careers around. So if you're looking for advice or guidance how to be cool outside of a specific moment in time or place, if it's not abundantly clear by my past decade on YouTube, y'all are in the wrong place. Click elsewhere. Or maybe don't, you might learn something. But there are some philosophers who have attempted some interesting work attempting to explain cool, or at least some of their thoughts around it. And there's a few broad empirical descriptions, so let's run through some of them. Number 1, cool is fundamentally subjective. I mean, there's no such thing as an objective measure of cool that can be measured, quantified, bought, inherited, or stolen. You know, it's generally considered positive to have. It contributes to social capital, which is why a lot of folks want it, because you want to be around cool people. But simply owning something, it's not going to make you cool by default, no matter what any hype beast selling you on a brand is going to tell you. Hell, we all know that rich dude who's got a ton of money and throws it around and thinks on on that basis alone he's super cool, when in reality he's a schmuck. Now there's no unit of absolute cool, getting cool points is colloquial, nobody's keeping a tab, and what might be considered cool in one group is likely not in another. I mean, sometimes it crosses over, but there is absolutely no guarantee of that, but that can make things difficult with number 2. Cool is autonomous. What this means is that someone or something who is cool can move with it of their own power. They're not constrained by what might constrain others. And they might stay in a place for a while of their choice. They can move on, not really have to worry about leaving their cool behind in the ideal state. It's flexibility. It's freedom. It's having enough power to do what you want when you want without that much of a check on how you use that power. We'll definitely come back to that. Now, as an expansion of this, cool is often equated with calm or stoicism, a relaxed force and balance, not one to cause many ripples, where the phrase be cool can be easily applied. Hell, there's an entire movie starring John Travolta in the mid-2000s with that title that tried to run on that vibe. I'm serious, Andre 3000's in it.
You call that a minute?
You don't even have to say nothing. I already know. I know. I can't help it, man. Don't give me no gun, man.
On another side, one thing that's pretty consistent with many cultures' appraisal of cool is the ability to dance. Not just in showing the grace and the movement, but also potentially sparking attraction to a partner, if you want it. And that leads to number 3. Cool is fundamentally social. Now that might seem a little strange when you think about it. A lot of us imagine cool as the disaffected, relaxed loner who isn't part of your system, man. But that's a concept of cool that needs social context to be relevant. More importantly, where one can actually use the social capital that comes with being cool. Let's face it, you can be a disaffected, relaxed loner by yourself, and nobody will care if you don't leave the house. You need the larger context of maintaining it while interacting with others. Hell, I'd go a step further and say coolness is conveyed upon you by others saying it or thinking it, not something you can just assume for yourself independently. I mean, you might think you can, you might even be rewarded by some of that self-belief, but you might as well just quickly wind up on the outside looking in. This is also where some philosophers will highlight that cool can have a pretty serious drawback despite that social requirement, because by necessity, you're blunting some of that earnest emotional connection with somebody else. German philosopher Thorsten Boltz-Bornstein, in his 2010 paper, What Does It Mean to Be Cool?, of which I think takes some broad reaches but mirrors a lot of my own assessments, he notes that the cool person lives in a constant state of alienation, a similar critique of detached stoicism that we'll have to revisit later on. One element I really like in his paper is his observation that cool has a relationship to the activity of play, wherein lessening the stakes in a game of power allows for greater detachment. But you can't just play with yourself. Well, I mean, you can, but the reality is that that's not all that cool either. It proves my point. Number 4. Cool at its root, especially in American culture, comes with a disavowal, conscious or unconscious. Many scholars highlight the usage of the word cool going back to the black jazz musicians of the 1930s. And it reminds me of old sayings around jazz and blues. It's about the words that are not being said, the notes that are not being played. And in a society that builds so much on what is tangibly there, the denial of information, the mystery, conveying more on emotions and vibes, that's where you might find cool. It's not being a part of your system. It's why cool is often associated with youthful rebellion against the status quo, whatever it might be, which in order to function and build anything, that status quo has to come from concrete, earnest intent. And cool reflexively pushes against that. Especially in a capitalist society, cool often comes with a disavowal of work. And that can push back against both an earnest socialist framing on how labor then contributes to value, which did occur in Soviet countries throughout the Cold War, but also in a Western capitalist framing as well, where one's value is more fixed to an established monetary price, and social capital sidesteps any of that quantification. It does not mean that those who are cool don't work at it. They often do way more than you think, but if they make it look easy, now that's cool, you get it. And there's another layer. If your disavowal is made with some degree of irony, that you might like or dislike something, but you're holding it at expression at a distance, or making your motives kind of fuzzy or unclear, well, that lack of information cultivates some mystery. That can also come across as more cool. In fact, you know what? Before we go on, let me give you a real-life example where some folks actually do consider me cool for some ungodly reason. YouTube. Now sure, to all of you, none of this shit is cool at all. I've got a catalog of material throughout the past decade that places me the furthest thing from cool, but when I've talked about doing well in person and even making money on YouTube to those who do not understand what the ecosystem's like, folks think it's kind of cool, because it's unique. They see people doing something that appears to require very little work, yet there's success, giving me the freedom to do more outside my 9 to 5. And hell, there are cases where if you disavow even trying to be cool under the mainstream commodification of the term, it swings around and potentially becomes cool by accident. Multiple layers of being disaffected online, or as it's now known, based. But this is where I've got a very harsh reality to deliver. Number 5. Cool is fundamentally transitory. Given how much of it relies upon autonomous freedom, it's not going to last. What might be cool one day is going to be uncool the next. And the more you try to control that process, the less cool you will wind up as a result. It's not always that the new is cool, or that old things or old people can't be cool, but that it doesn't really tend to linger, and youth tend to be the ones more willing to keep up because, hell, the more you get to know something or someone, more often than not, the less cool they are. I mean, you've all seen this before. The person who might seem really super cool at first impression, but the more they talk, the more they demystify themselves, the less cool they are, or the more you can tell they're expending so much effort to make it look as though it's effortless. It's also why the internet and the vast influx of information has exposed so many people as being so uncool. When you add the entire world to your party and so many more different frames of reference, the likelihood you're going to be cool in all of them is exponentially harder. Now, note in this list, I did not equate cool with any type of expertise, like you being good at something. Just because someone is good or bad at something does not translate to coolness, although competency can hold up the glamour a little while longer. Note that I also didn't equate cool with any one side of the political spectrum. There is a political angle we're going to have to explore with the relationship with power. That comes later. There's also, I regret to say, a bit of a generational divide that's worth highlighting, that certain generations are being perceived as being cooler than others. The big two being Gen X and Gen Z. Two generations raised on the casual, ironic deflection in the way that baby boomers and millennials definitely were not. Indeed, you can point to a lot of antipathy towards millennials in the 2010s with their strident earnestness to try to make hope and change from a cooler, disillusioned generation had no time for that sort of naivete and bullshit. Now, Justin Timberlake's in that fuzzy borderline between Gen X and millennials, especially in his audience, and that becomes relevant to the next big question.
I'm bringing sexy back. Yeah. The mother boys don't know how to act. Yeah. I think it's special what's behind your back.
So questions like this are surprisingly difficult to answer because, again, cool, it's highly subjective and it's transitory, best observed in social situations and with the foreknowledge of, regardless of what you might think on the subject, you don't know for sure. I mean, Justin Timberlake was certainly being marketed as cool, especially by his second album, Futuresex Lovesounds, in September 2006, which many today would probably rightly describe as his best. Justified may have signified the end of the boy band years, but this was the project that put him properly on the A-list, and to the public and critics alike, cemented his stardom. But you know, running through all that loose criteria, with the acknowledgement that it's all subjective, no one person can speak definitively on it, it sure felt like the formula was working. I remember living through it, moving away from the Neptunes to work predominantly with Timbaland, who was in the middle of his insane mid-2000s hot streak. Justin Timberlake showed that he could evolve with his sound and maintain enough mainstream hip-hop cred with T.I. and 3 6 Mafia on board. Yes, I know will.i.am is here as well, but this is also where the Black Eyed Peas were right in the middle of their chart commercial smash of the mid-2000s, only to get bigger as the decade concluded. I'm assuming this is payback and returning the favor for Where's the Love. Keep in mind, these were all songs built for the clubs and the dance floors. They all went long, they went to some weird places, but JT was running on raw charisma and groove, and it was his first album in 4 years. 66 minutes was not that bad for those who have been waiting so long, and scarcity can often help make you cool too. And while some of the album's lovesick pleading could feel a bit desperate or oversold with the benefit of hindsight, Timberlake always had that easy disavowal of the consummate player in the sharp suit. Yeah, it might get a bit kinky, he might want you, but it also underscored how much of this is on his own terms. To quote Bort Sparnstein again, a paradoxical fusion of submission and subversion. And I mean, look, I was a teenager in that era. It almost seemed like on force of will alone, Justin Timberlake was cool, even if he had come from a boy band. Teenage guys could admit it. He had style, he could dance, he had the success, he had the critical acclaim, he had the Grammy wins off this album. He won for Justified as well, but this felt like he'd moved into the big leagues. He had 3 number ones, plus another from a major collab that we will have to touch on in a bit. And even the folks who thought Sexy Back was a total clusterfuck and the lyrics were still all mediocre, they are, it couldn't help but deny that whatever was here, it seemed to be working on pure force of will. And I gotta stress, in the mid-2000s, this sort of pop culture ubiquity, when paired with style, good connections, a frankly ridiculous amount of acclaim, and some really good music, it'd have a lot of folks call you cool. I mean, root for the winner, you know? It didn't just stay in music either.
Take a look inside. Is my in a box?
He was able to laugh at himself in some of the most acclaimed SNL sketches of that era. He started acting in movies, and okay, yeah, the filmography of JT is spotty, and someone not named me should explain what the hell he thought he was doing in Black Snake Moan and Southland Tales back to back, but he was also in The Social Network, and in Time, and Inside Llewyn Davis. Netted some decent reviews for his performances. Not really a leading man, but he was becoming the sort of celebrity that in that era seemed to do no wrong, or at least he was moving fast enough with enough acclaim and great publicity along the way, you'd probably be shouted down if you seriously challenged it. But some did. And not without good reason. So in 2004, Janet Jackson was booked to perform at the Super Bowl halftime show. There had been talks to have her perform back in 2002, but a bunch of NFL execs went with U2 instead after seeing one of their live shows, and that should tell you exactly how serious the NFL took some of these decisions back in the early 2000s. But a couple years later, Janet Jackson tapped for the halftime show, and she chose Justin Timberlake as a surprise guest. I mean, it's not that surprising if you were in the know. Janet had been a longtime fan of NSYNC. She had them as openers on her Velvet Rope tour, and she and Justin had a working relationship where she sang backing vocals on a song from Justified. The two were professional colleagues, dare I even say friends, alongside a couple rumors of a romantic partnership that never seemed to amount to anything beyond rumors. Let's move on. So when he joined her on stage for a duet of Rock Your Body, after performances including Nelly and Kid Rock, the early 2000s everyone, there was some precedent for Justin Timberlake showing up. A little less so when he ripped off a portion of her costume, exposing her bare breast to the viewing public for about a second or two before the cameras cut away. Ugh. Look, it was nearly 20 years ago. It's hard for me to quantify just how much of a media firestorm there was around this shit, and the onslaught of conspiracy theories as well that have persisted to this day. Now, the running story was that there was a wardrobe malfunction, that Justin Timberlake's act was merely intended to expose her bra, play in line with the final line of the song of Rock Your Body. So, despite them not telling CBS or the NFL, this was planned. Apparently MTV knew about it too, although not the full scope. Now, the presence of a nipple guard has sparked up some conspiracy that it was always intended to go a little bit too far in the run-up to Janet Jackson's album coming a month later, Demita Joe. Given that this event certainly dominated all the media coverage that surrounded the album, I'm kind of skeptical of this, given that Janet's star power wasn't really fading after All For You had multiple top 5 hits, including the title track going to to #1. I also don't buy the theory it was intended as payback to upstage Britney Spears kissing Madonna at the 2003 VMAs. That felt like bullshit gossip, even if Justin Timberlake has a petty streak, which both on and off record I think is true. I've also seen folks say that more folks knew beyond Justin Timberlake, Janet Jackson, and MTV, given the presence of tearaway clothes for Nelly's dancers when he did Hot in Her. Look, that feels like correlation being mistaken for causation, not relevant. But what did occur was the largest rash of FCC complaints and fines leveled in history in response to conservative America seeing a bare breast on TV for about a second. I know in the era of the internet, where flashing bare breasts at concerts is way more common than you think, it's barely even a publicity stunt anymore. Porn is everywhere, and if you know where to look, bare breasts are easy enough to find on this platform. But it was the 2000s. And the sex-negative fallout from this event and the FCC's record fines in response to it generally led to sexual portrayals on TV getting scaled back. The Victoria's Secret fashion show got axed that year. I know they denied that it was because of this at the time. I don't buy that for a second. Broader indecency charges were thrown across TV and radio, and even some, including Janet Jackson, asserting that the media explosion was intended by the administration as a distraction to the increasingly disastrous Iraq war by Republican bureaucrats in the FCC who used it as an excuse to crack down wherever they could. Hell, some actually argued it played into George W. Bush's lean on the moralism and decency arc in his presidential run that year. All the more galling given how the Super Bowl performance was intended to drive youth voting, and I don't know, the elements of decency that Bush really leaned into. But Janet Jackson took the brunt of the backlash. Despite making a public apology on air, she was still barred from the Grammys that year thanks to Les Moonves blackballing her across all of Viacom, including stripping her of a TV movie that she was set to star in. I'm going to note here that in 2018, multiple women brought forth allegations of sexual misconduct by Moonves to them to cement his already rock-bottom reputation as a TV executive and total slimeball. But the blacklist also spilled onto the radio, where despite selling and reviewing well, Damita Jo did not really see much charting success for the singles. She would have one charting breakthrough with Nelly a couple years later, and Feedback as a lead-off single from the album Discipline. Can't make this up, folks. It only cracked the top 20, even if it did make the year-end list. And even as Janet Jackson played it light, even parodied the event on SNL, it was the sort of body blow to her career in which few recover. Justin Timberlake, meanwhile, delivered his first statement to Access Hollywood, says, "Hey man, we love giving y'all something to talk about." And while he gave a more apologetic statement later, I feel like he probably had to, many were quick to note that he avoided the vast majority of the blowback despite actually being the one who did the ripping of the clothing. Hell, he was allowed to go to the Grammys in 2004, while Janet Jackson was denied because, I don't know, the Grammys just can't stop themselves from being on the wrong side of every single fucking issue. And in the following years, it became abundantly clear that Timberlake's career was not about to be tarnished or short-circuited, and he avoided the majority of the blowback. Increasingly not helped when in 2006, he said in an interview with MTV that he probably should have gotten more of it. But you know, society tends to be harsher on women and ethnic people. Jesus Christ, dude. But okay, why bring any of this up in a conversation about the coolness of Justin Timberlake in this time? Well, Janet Jackson was not the only Jackson with whom Timberlake had a relationship. Yep, the late Michael Jackson, Janet's older brother and the pop icon who laid the template for the music that Justin Timberlake was making. And rolling back to the turn of the millennium, Michael Jackson was going through one of the worst stages of his career imaginable, featuring label disputes where he called the CEO of Sony Music a racist devil. Fun fact, that CEO was married to Mariah Carey for 4 years, and the album Invincible was in development hell, and then there was his own truly horrific allegations. Now, Michael Jackson had not released released any album since 1995. But by the time NSYNC was putting out Celebrity, when Justin Timberlake was still with NSYNC, he offered multiple songs to Michael, like one of their few good singles from that era, Gone, and Michael turned them down. Now, he seemed more amicable to Girlfriend, but insisted that it be a solo duet between Justin Timberlake and Michael Jackson, and that wasn't really happening in 2001. Although Timberlake does credit it as the moment where he first considered going solo, if Michael believed in him. What's more, the majority of the tracks on Justified, they were intended and written for Michael Jackson, and he also turned them down, because apparently he wanted the R. Kelly co-write as the single instead. Now, all this would culminate in Michael Jackson releasing Invincible in October 2001. It's a pretty bad album, only further hamstrung by 9/11 wrecking any touring plans around that time, and about a year later, Justin Timberlake releases Justified with better songs that Michael could have had, and I don't even think Justified is that good of an album. Now, on the one hand, Michael Jackson throughout the late 90s and a lot of the 2000s, he was in a very bad place, well past his prime, and the allegations were blowing holes in his iconic status. The tabloids would do that. To many in pop culture at large, he'd become a punchline, which is why Eminem, to his later regret, thought he could get away with so many pot shots in 2004's Encore. But on the other hand, the ease in which Justin Timberlake was working to seize that mantle of king of pop with casual disregard to multiple Jacksons, it left a very sour taste in a lot of mouths. And it didn't stop there either. In 2006, in the wake of Sexy Back becoming a massive hit, Prince was so disgusted that in a post-Emmys party, he proclaimed, "For those proclaiming that sexy's back, sexy never left." And a year later, on a collab track with Timbaland and Nelly Furtado that eventually went to number 1, Justin Timberlake responded.
Could you speak up and stop my mumbling? I don't think you came in clear. Sitting on the top, it's hard to hear you from way up here.
The song was called Give It To Me. It was a diss track. The most obvious diss was coming from Timbaland, who at this point was openly beefing with his former keyboardist and protege and producer in his own right, Scott Storch. And okay, fine, Scott Storch made a lot of crap in the mid-2000s. He flamed out spectacularly. I get why Timbaland was going there. Now, Nelly Furtado was apparently dissing Fergie. I was kind of stunned to discover this in retrospect. Fergie, it being in the Black Eyed Peas, that had to be punishment enough. But again, I kind of get it. Nelly Furtado's album Loose was arguably better than anything Fergie did in the mid-2000s, and whatever bad blood sprung out of that, I'd still say Furtado wins. Justin Timberlake was dissing Prince.
I saw you trying to act cute on TV, just let me clear the air. We missed you on the charts last week, damn, that's right, you wasn't there.
Now, some assume that the first half of his verse is also dissing Janet Jackson and referencing an Oprah interview. I personally think that's a bit of a reach. But the second half of that verse, it's definitely targeting Prince.
Sexy never left, and why is everybody on my it don't hate on me just because you didn't come up with it.
And say what you will about Justin Timberlake as a pop star, as an A-list superstar and celebrity, he's nowhere near close to being on Prince's level and will never be. Full stop. And yet, for as much as Prince was churning out the albums in the 2000s, sometimes more than one a year, they were selling and reviewing okay, but nowhere close to the numbers and acclaim that Timberlake had. In retrospect, it's just really bad taste to diss a pop icon who is not only more talented than you with more classic albums where you clearly draw influence, but was also so clearly screwed by his label situation, he was never going to get the promotion to respond on the same footing. But really, who is going to stop Justin Timberlake? And none of it's helped by the fact that, well, Give It To Me is one of the best hits from all three artists. It's one of my favorite hit songs of the decade, and it worked because it played on that towering arrogance and swagger that only made it that much more emotionally compelling. But that's the meat of it. In American music, a sense of cool was fundamentally rooted in black culture, because so much of music is rooted in black culture, especially that in which Justin Timberlake was presenting himself as the obvious descendant. And while there's been a lot of contentious discourse in recent years calling Justin Timberlake a culture vulture, especially in the wake of Man of the Woods, where those claims have probably the most teeth coming and highlighting that for as much as Timberlake has taken from black producers, black co-writers, black guest stars, black influences, he then retreats to a stereotypical white genre when the going was getting tough, and he was far from the most gracious in giving back, especially in his treatment of the icons to which he owed the most. Again, there's teeth to it. Now, to many, the aftermath of the Janet Jackson incident, it was unforgivable, even more in hindsight. To those in the know, the fallout with Michael Jackson and Prince only made things worse, especially when both acts were at career low points and Justin Timberlake was on top punching down. But media and pop culture at large seemed like they were giving Justin Timberlake a pass for all of it, especially for the public that was less online and generally less informed. Now, to be fair, Justin Timberlake was only in his mid-20s when all of this was happening, and he was never in a situation where he would have to hear and respond to more direct criticism outside the Super Bowl catastrophe, but he was able to skate just by. And the cruel, hierarchical, conservative machismo tilt of pop culture in the 2000s, it was built on consolidating cool and especially power at the very top for the now, not for the icons of the past. Who cares about them? I mean, those are the values of the time, where by the end of the decade, terms like post-racial were getting thrown around, and systemic analysis, it's not getting the discourse that we see today, certainly not in the pre-social media, mainstream entertainment press. I mean, Justin Timberlake was way more concerned about cultivating his hip-hop connections, fostering a rivalry with Usher, than really engaging with scandals the white public they were eager to ignore anyway. And it should be noted that while on the R&B charts, Justin Timberlake had a lot less of a presence than you might expect, it wasn't like the acts of the day were shunning them. I mean, he built a connection with Jay-Z, he and T.I. traded chart-topping singles, he even teamed up with 50 Cent for AO Technology, the impossibly dated song with 50's ill-advised feud with Kanye West that blew up in his face. But again, this is interesting. Not like Justin Timberlake took any blowback from that, nor when he and his management missed the big opportunity to help mentor Justin Bieber, losing out to Usher in one of the most wild, what might have been alternative timelines in pop music. But this is where we do have to encounter the other side of any conversation about cool and Justin Timberlake.
She's got the love stone, and I swear she's bad and she knows. I think that she knows.
So one reason I've been so thorough in categorizing Justin Timberlake's history, so long-winded, now we haven't even gotten to the 2010s in the analysis, let alone the 2020 experience, is partially because these are thoughts I've been stewing on for 15 to 20 years, but also to provide some of the cultural context behind Justin Timberlake's ascent and the popular sense of cool at the time. His exchange with black culture is a very mixed bag, to be way too charitable. To me, it comes across more as idiocy, as the product of world-conquering celebrity way too young. But pop celebrities of his era were not required to be informed on these sorts of issues, especially at his age and given the kind of music he made. You could absolutely expect and hope for more, but when you were this cool and when you were this successful, the celebrity apparatus was built to reinforce that, especially given how much money Justin Timberlake was bringing in. But the other major side to any conversation about cool is to whom Justin Timberlake directed the majority of his art and whose careers have fallen predominantly in his wake. Women. Not all women, he clearly idolizes them. He had working and professional relationships with Nelly Furtado and Christina Aguilera. He gave Madonna a pretty great late 2000s hit with 4 Minutes. Kind of interesting how white pop royalty gets a different treatment here. But the overhanging context of the hellish years that Britney Spears and Janet Jackson saw in the wake of Justin Timberlake's actions, they're hard to ignore. And it raises a specter in which any discussion of coolness and how women don't tend to be considered. I mean, this is a problem with all the non-feminist philosophy in general, especially in a patriarchal society, especially in the 2000s, where anti-feminist backlash rolled through all of culture at large through a solid decade. But like its earlier forebear in Stoicism, you don't hear a lot of association or discussion of cool being applied to women as a whole, or even a lot of the studies I found trying to explore cool as a societal construct, they focus predominantly on men. I mean, there are exceptions to this rule. Insert the cool girl monologue from Gone Girl, Rihanna in general.
She's a cool girl. Cool girl is hot. Cool girl is gay. Cool girl is fun. Cool girl never gets angry at her man. She only smiles in a chagrin-loving manner and then presents her mouth for fucking. She likes what he likes, so evidently, he's a vinyl hipster who loves fetish manga.
But cool is most often associated with men, even back to some of the origin points across culture, from early European dandies to the enslaved black men in the Americas who cultivated their sense of cool to maintain some degree of calm and control while being brutally disempowered. So when talking about women, well, if cool is subjective to the scene, who defines that scene's guidelines? Especially if there's any play in mainstream culture at large. If cool is tied to autonomy, how does that exist alongside of women who across decades, if not centuries, have struggled to attain that same level of freedom as men, made all the more difficult when the social norms around cool come with men achieving female companionship, making them a prize to be won. And given that cool is its own form of social capital, adding consent as a part of that conversation is more recent than many folks want to even admit. And the transitory factor, shit, that's at the root of slut shaming, where men can be lauded for being cool and moving between partners, but if a woman does the same or attempts to have that same sort of mobility, she's the slut. But here's the most key point. It comes with a disavowal inherent to being cool, not being part of your system, man, because cool is often individualized. And when it's applied to a group, it stops short of actually agitating for changing of the system, because that often requires earnest effort. And where the glamour and disaffection of being cool starts feeling a lot less relevant to people's lives. The other reason it tends to be associated with a lot of youth who don't yet have the responsibilities that require they treat things with higher stakes, the shit that actually matters. This is a problem that extends into some forms of stoicism as well, that when women highlight systemic barriers that should be challenged, the cool disavowal, the sneer at the system, focus on yourself, not really fight the system, it's tawdry, or it's beholden to a context not defined by you. That's the whole point of the cool girl monologue.
My cute, charming, salt-of-the-earth Missouri guy. He needed to learn. Grown-ups work for things. Grown-ups pay. Grown-ups suffer consequences.
That skewers the male feminist who pay lip service to it without confronting the system and the advantages they have within it. Now, Justin Timberlake falls in that territory. He's a pop R&B star who predominantly focused his art on women, and more often with a more forceful and clunky lyricism that's dogged his entire career. It's all built to reinforce an ideal of cool, where his target audience might be women, but he's trying most to win over the guys, especially coming from the boy band background where all of the focus was on teenage girls. Ergo, the rap collabs, all the production, especially the very sexually charged image and presentation of Futuresex Lovesounds. And it most often worked because the archetype that Justin Timberlake was celebrating in 2006, it was the dominant one. It compounds power rather than questions it. The sleek, well-dressed, rich, modern American man in a great business suit and a tight haircut that could be sensitive, but always had just enough of the asshole side to disavow that. Build the flirtation, little bit of edge to it too. Justin Timberlake's not unique in this. It's a template that's existed for male pop and R&B stars, black or white, for decades. It's not built to challenge power structures that give them the space to spend social capital, thus encouraging the emotional response of guys who want to emulate it. And since we're also dealing with machismo and how being the sensitive lover man got you called gay, especially in the 2000s, you gotta disavow just enough of your sincerity to keep it moving. I mean, you can call it toxic, it is, but especially in the 2000s, society was organized so that you would be rewarded by both men and women for it if you were cool. Hell, by the end of the decade, even if you weren't, neither patriarchy or white supremacy or meritocracies. And that takes us, finally, to where this conversation gets really messy. So, class has an odd relationship with cool, and one thing that's been exposed over the past 20 or so years is that it's not as adversarial as some would like it to be. Keep in mind how much cool is rooted in black culture, a historically disenfranchised group, especially under white supremacist capitalism. And now those who were considered cool were often setting themselves against the status quo, aka those people who have money or responsibilities. And I've already said that simply having money is no guarantee of actually being considered cool. But consider some of those other factors, like freedom and disavowal being some of the most notable ones. It's easy to disavow or ignore systems that might constrain you if you have enough money not to be constrained. I mean, if the system isn't really hurting you that much, it becomes all the more easy to loudly disavow it without making any real serious moves in order to challenge it. And that's not a new observation either. British counterculture philosophers Dick Putain and David Robbins observed in their 2000 paper how cultivating a sense of coolness could feed into a capitalist consumer culture, and that put them at odds with the New Labour movement of the time, for as much as New Labour turned into anything. But this is also how the cultivation shunned political engagement of all stripes, but for consumption, and hell, consumption gets a lot easier when you've got money to spend. In that way, it calls back to the aristocrats and dandies of Europe in the 17 to 1800s, who didn't have the same obligation to work and could pursue social capital in their scenes that are rife with melodrama, which carries on to this day across the rich children of inherited wealth in the Americas. Cool may have originated among poor black men in America as a survival mechanism. White culture at large opted for a glamour of cool, with much lower stakes but heightened flair, and that serves the status quo, plain and simple. When there's structural inequalities that persist or are only getting worse, coolness becomes a bit of a tightrope. I mean, you want the glamour and success that comes with the social capital of being cool, often reinforced by wealth and power, if not directly purchased by it, but here's the risk. If you compromise the relatability or the flex becomes out of step with the social conditions that might give you the cool, you could be in real trouble. Enter into this the 2020 Experience, released in March of 2013. Justin Timberlake had not put out an album since 2006, outside of a quick compilation of remixes that he dumped in 2010. He sat out the club boom. He spent the intervening years building up his acting resume, and more importantly, as I said, he knew that scarcity is on his side when maintaining that sense of cool. If you control the flow of information beyond recording the album in secret, keep a sharp limit on just how much art you put out to be scrutinized, you can be afforded to maintain the glamours a little bit longer. More importantly, while the passage of time meant that it was possible for Justin Timberlake was maybe out of step when it came to trends, the A-list clout was at that point where if he had enough of the right names, wouldn't even matter. James Fauntleroy of the Cocaine 80s stepped up to aid Timbaland on production, a redemption and well overdue after Timbaland drove his career into the ground at the end of the 2000s. And the solitary guest star, rap mogul Jay-Z, the biggest name to get, as many deemed him the best rapper working, especially after many thought he added another spark to his career with Watch the Throne to offset the whole disaster that was the Blueprint 3. And it was an album that was leaning on a lot of the strengths that Justin Timberlake had built up 7 years earlier. It was opulent, it was expensive sounding in the production, it had superb vocal presence where if the lyrics fell short, would not matter, because the project was built to overwhelm the senses, clocking in at 70 minutes as his longest album to date. And the central conceit? It wasn't a bad one. Justin Timberlake was not going to be chasing the cool that came in the moment, but look backwards. The 2020 Experience, Hindsight. The album's title was indicative of the brand of cool that it was looking to cultivate, one rooted in old money and good taste and class, and it would surely dominate as it has, time and time again. Right? Well, at first, it seemed to work. While there were some odd rumors swirling around a Live Nation deal that Justin Timberlake had struck back in 2009, potentially contributing to the rushed promo of this album in early 2013, so he wouldn't have to return any of the millions of dollars should he not start touring, and he needed new material to tour, the album itself had been secretly recorded in 2012, albeit quickly. To the public, the timetable of Justin Timberlake's return might seem abrupt, but this was in the works for a while. 2 credible hits with Suit and Tie and Mirrors. The album had the biggest sales week of 2013. It was nominated for Grammys. It clinched a measure of critical acclaim, made some year-end lists. All the stars seemed to align for Justin Timberlake's brand of cool to reign supreme again, but something fell amiss. The singles were built to go to number 1, felt like they would achieve that success almost by birthright, and didn't. Instead being beaten by an upstart Seattle rapper.
I'm gonna pop some tags, only got $20 in my pocket. I'm hunting, looking for a come up. This is fucking awesome.
Who was marketing himself as an independent, but even if that wasn't fully true, he still had far less backing than Justin fucking Timberlake, and the contrast between them was stark, especially between the singles that went head to head. 2 white guys playing deeply in the veins of black music and asserting very different ideals of cool. I mean, Justin Timberlake had the Suit and Tie, luxuriant production, and the biggest rapper in the world behind him on a short summer stadium tour for both of their albums, duly anointed to ascend to the throne and take the success that is so rightfully his in pop music, only to be blocked from the top spot by a borderline novelty act about shopping at the goddamn thrift store and making savvy consumer decisions. Keep in mind, this was not a battle between capitalism or any serious left-wing agenda. Advocating being a better consumer because you have less money to spend, it's still in service of a capitalist paradigm, and that the value it's placed on the cost that you give it. Macklemore wasn't really about changing the system. We soon come to know that in spades, but it certainly felt like something had shifted. That Justin Timberlake felt out of step with where his audience might be in the early 2010s. And label executives were indeed worried about Suit and Tie's early, sluggish sales run. And you know, there might be something to that. The right-leaning, neoconservative, alpha male bravado of the 2000s, it had smashed right into the 2008 financial crisis, which left the United States of America, really the entire world, in recession and an uncertain economic recovery where the majority of the gains and the bailouts have been swallowed up by the 1%, the ultra-wealthy. There were movements that questioned the central structure of capital, most notably Occupy Wall Street in 2011. But after Barack Obama won a second term at the end of 2012 without really providing any sort of systemic change outside of half-heartedly catching up with the rest of the world when it came with the Affordable Care Act, aka Obamacare, there was an odd sense that even to the most tentative questions of the system, America was going to party even louder and harder and ignore them. Hey, good guys won. Why not go all out? Have some fun. But in comparison with the club boom, where the biggest star, Kesha, sounded most often like she had no money and still partied her ass off with plenty of whiskey, and in some of the nascent indie rock swell of 2012, 2013 was an assertion of traditional, even backwards-looking pop sounds and structures that could pat themselves on the back for doing the nominally right thing, but keep spending. Keep living large. I mean, I can see how in that environment, the 2020 experience was built to do really well. And yet, despite coming from the biggest name, it never got to the top. And as 2013 continued, it became all the more glaring. I mean, Macklemore got a second #1 hit with Can't Hold Us.
Return to the Mac. Get up what it is, what it does, what it is, what it isn't. Looking for a better way to get up out of bed instead of getting on the internet and checking a new hit me get up.
And while Just Give Me a Reason by Nate Ruess and Pink, still a weird collab, it got an adult alternative staple, and Billboard themselves fucked up by being unable to handle the Harlem Shake by Bauer crashing to #1 thanks to YouTube virality. Let's be real, Justin Timberlake still should have been able to break through, at least by the summer. But then came 2 songs that blunted his chart momentum in mid-step, and the poetry of their ascent speaks volumes. The first, we all know it, it's Get Lucky, an outright throwback disco tune from Timberlake's old collaborator Pharrell, on the back of a project that was all about celebrating the past coming from Daft Punk, Random Access Memories, a duo that had been absent from releasing music about as long as Justin Timberlake. But okay, that's Daft Punk, with what many would call one of the best songs of the decade, and they didn't even get the #1 either. I mean, surely there would be enough room to break through then. There was at least an excuse, but there's no excuse for this.
Everybody get up.
Yeah, Blurred Lines, the sort of chart-topping summer smash that has everyone looking back on 2013 with aghast, what the hell were we even thinking expressions, especially when I tell you it topped the charts for 12 weeks. Not only did it come from Pharrell, and a short-lived comeback for Timberlake's old friend T.I., this was from Robin Thicke, a pop star who spent his entire career imitating Justin Timberlake's formula with more of an adult R&B flair. If I'm on Justin Timberlake's promotional staff, I gotta be tearing my goddamn hair out that with all of the opulence, with all the expense at your disposal, where if you don't get a #1 hit, it starts raising some serious questions on what the hell all the effort was even for, especially following off the mega success of Futuresex Lovesounds. I mean, you can't beat this goober ripping off your own formula. It's like Future not getting his #1 before Designer. It doesn't make any sense. I mean, surely any of the songs getting pushed from the 2020 experience, they were good enough in order to beat Blurred Lines, right? Right? Okay, so I'm sure you've all noticed that I've talked more around the 2020 experience than about the characteristics of the album itself. There's kind of a reason for that. When it comes to content and themes, the 2020 experience, it's not very interesting. I mean, lyrics have always been Justin Timberlake's greatest weakness as a songwriter, but if you could look past that, if the songs were sharp or focused, or even if they embraced some of the extravagance with a package where that sense of cool could sustain all the vibes. But there is only 10 songs here, with the average length clocking around 7 minutes of some very busy, meticulous mixes without a lot of depth that don't really evoke much with multiple parts, with gratuitous length where the discourse started forming around ear fatigue with regards to the 2020 experience. And it later came out in interviews that Justin Timberlake didn't really care if the songs were shortened in order to get radio play and shipped. I remember being very bothered by this at the time when I reviewed the album back in 2013, and then it seemed to imply that if you were willing to put on the album, you just put up with all the indulgence. But in retrospect, it might actually be worse, because many of these songs seemed very easily composed for that radio edit. And it comes to the realization that for all the grandiose experiments in class, cool, and ego, it might be a bit more precarious than Justin Timberlake thought. And that's not surprising when you look at the most revealing song on the album, and in my opinion, one of his best ever hits, and that's a contentious opinion, Mirrors.
I don't wanna lose you now. I'm looking right at the other half of me. The biggest thing that's set in my heart is a space, and now you're home.
I know, JT fans, I know. Mirrors is often seen as a cynical play for pop dominance. It's not cool. It's not as composed as Timberlake usually is. But to me, it's revealing in a fascinating way that when Justin Timberlake looks to elevate a partner in his desperate love song, he sees himself, an amplification of his own power. But hey, if you're actually cool, why would you need that reinforcement? Seems like he himself was aware that something might have been missing along the way. It's also one reason I really like the song. I've always said before, I'm not always drawn to the A-listers where the cool sounds so effortless. I'm not always struck with that same desire to attempt to emulate it because I'm also kind of realistic about my chances to do so. But when I hear songs that actually crack that veneer of glamour, it helps humanize Justin Timberlake, and I appreciate the flair so much more because I know what goes into it. It's also why my favorite Beyonce album is Lemonade. But here's an interesting note. Justin Timberlake might be looking in a mirror, but unlike many who use that metaphor, it doesn't seem to be giving him that much introspection to be confronted with himself. Moreover, as I previously mentioned, cool does not really come with introspection. It's outward facing, it's social. If you're navel gazing by yourself, that ain't cool. And yet, if that's how you choose to market yourself to the mainstream public, and you build your foundation of cool on so much opulence, wealth, and success as the guy at the #1, I mean, America had just come out of a crushing recession where wealth was only further being concentrated at the top. You were losing some of that greater relatability, and any sense of cool, was starting to curdle, especially with the internet. If you think that assessment's off the mark,
Holy Grail!
that same year, Justin Timberlake contributed an increasingly pissy hook to Holy Grail, one of Jay-Z's absolute worst songs, one of his worst ever albums, and Magna Carta Holy Grail, complaining about the stresses of wealth and success. It was the petulance of two men not being satisfied with being at the very top, out of step with the population at large, and not doing any introspection to wonder why. A song that's only gotten worse with every successive year. Now with Jay-Z, some introspection would actually come in 2017, with his marriage taken to the brink and him chronicling it on 444. Justin Timberlake would not be that smart. In late September of 2013, Justin Timberlake would release the 2020 Experience 2 of 2, a clunky title for his sister album that seemingly came from out of nowhere as even longer and was far more revealing than I think Justin Timberlake intended. I mean, I'm lukewarm on releasing multiple albums in a year as it is, unless you're King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard or Billy Woods. It doesn't tend to end well, especially for mainstream artists who previously built so much of their mystique and cool on scarcity, but it wasn't really that much of a surprise. A day after the first album dropped, Questlove leaked that a follow-up was coming with 10 more songs, get the even 20, except this actually ran for 11 songs, so scrap all that. But I did get a real sinking feeling because you would think, with all the time spent in recording, that they could have narrowed this down to a truly transcendent, maybe 10 to 12 songs rather than flood the market. Unless Justin Timberlake was convinced that this sort of opulent approach and lean on clout was built for longer term success. I mean, he's the A-list artist who has seen nothing but success. Who the hell's gonna tell him otherwise? I mean, you'd think his longtime manager Johnny Wright might have said something or warned him, but they thought they could make it work. Maybe even just treat it as B-sides, especially if the 2020 Experience was a proven hitmaker. But like with the first, 2 of 2 was operating on a lot of cool and opulence, and it ran even longer and paired its Jay-Z guest appearance with one from Drake. It was the Night album compared to the brighter production of the earlier forebear. And while Justin Timberlake used that as an excuse to pivot into some weirder territory, the already sketchy lyrics took a nosedive, and the production felt increasingly claustrophobic against experiments that definitely showed Justin Timberlake imitating more sides of Michael Jackson than he probably should have. Now look, I was not against the experimentation on 2 of 2 in principle. Even the country pivot, Drink You Away, that would foretell what would come 5 years later. But let's be real, going back to our conversations around cool, the more we heard of Justin Timberlake in 2013, the more that sense of glamour was fracturing. And when you're running on so much cool and adrenaline, not only did earnest experiments become both high risk, high reward, but overexposure could highlight flaws previously obscured by all the dazzling shine. It got even worse when the lead-off single, Take Back the Night, a song that openly rips off Wanna Be Startin' Something, it got in hot water with the Take Back the Night Foundation, an anti-rape organization that kind of took issue with the song's sexual content that was treading into dicey territory at odds with their message. Keep in mind, this came out in the same year as Blurred Lines. Now, Justin Timberlake pleaded ignorance, the controversy settled relatively quickly, but it was bad buzz that only got worse with TKO.
TKO.
An incredibly bitter second single and one of the worst songs on any album. Only the placid play for Adult Alternative, Not a Bad Thing, managed to crack the top 10, and by then, the album had reviewed poorly and, yeah, sold well, but far short of what the first 2020 Experience did. And yeah, that's to be expected, but it was a sign that the wheels might have been coming off this train, that Justin Timberlake's brand of cool might be fading pretty fast in the face of something that was more prescient and relevant, especially any throne that he might have had.
I've never seen a diamond in the flesh. I cut my teeth on wedding rings in the movies.
I feel like the success and cultural significance of Royals is a bit overstated in well, hindsight, it did spark a movement of pop starlets in the mid-2010s that would imitate her sound and formula, but like I said at the time, Royals is a great critique of the pop culture at the time, but didn't really have the follow-through to suggest a lot of change. Now, that's a lot to expect out of any sort of teenage pop star, but that was what it was promising, how it was marketed and framed. But what goes ignored was how cool the sound and vibe was perceived. And that makes sense. Lorde was openly disavowing the existing power structures in mainstream music. Also a little bit overstated in my opinion in that disavowal, even with hip-hop, which was very much in flux, but she was doing it with poise and populism. And more importantly, speaking to a generation that did not have the money to be playing at the parties celebrated across the majority of 2013. The song was building social capital, not exactly a challenge to the system on its fundamental level, but it felt like it could mean more, like a major shift could be coming, a new sound compared to a year of male-dominated throwbacks. And among young, mainstream music consumers, it promised a brand of cool that placed Justin Timberlake kind of in the past tense. I mean, it wasn't an end to his career by any stretch, but it was a sign that the rules were being rewritten, and the assumed power and cool that he had might be slipping through his fingers. And be it in his musical output or his past that was slowly catching up to him, Justin Timberlake might have a lot of exceeding talent and wealth, but a sense of cool might be leaving the conversation. I feel obligated to mention that in 2013, for many, it's an absolute success for Justin Timberlake. That his formula of equating his taste to class to manifest cool, it seemed to work, but I'm not sure how outside of that very brief window how much runway there really was, and mistakes that he himself made only seemed to shorten it. Yes, the 2020 experience 2 of 2 was a total misfire, especially in how it would foretell future disasters, but I think it's very telling that the 2020 experience itself has aged weirdly and certainly doesn't get brought up in the way that many other acts from that era do. Might have sparked a brief flicker of retro throwback hits in the mid-2010s, but honestly, I'd give way more credit to Bruno Mars than Justin Timberlake, especially as Bruno was able to keep the fire burning and with Uptown Funk delivered a classic song with Mark Ronson along the way. Now, pop certainly wouldn't try to emulate Justin Timberlake's sound, nor would R&B. The sound got leaner and cheaper to produce, and stars like Frank Ocean and The Weeknd, the latter of whom would support Justin Timberlake on the 2020 Experience World Tour on the early stops, they would find different landscapes of opulence to showcase. Now, Ed Sheeran would get Pharrell to rip off early Justin Timberlake would sing, but his career would take way too many strange pivots and would not stay there. And pop stars like Shawn Mendes and Justin Bieber would play to a smaller scale. They wouldn't have the same swell of Timberlake. I'd argue as a pop star, Drake probably absorbed the majority of Timberlake's swagger and conflation of cool with wealth, but rarely old-fashioned class. And when he does do it, he tends to get wildly overpraised for those overlong verses. Hell, whenever Jay-Z drops one of his hyper-capitalist verses, he does too. Hell, that conflation became a real winner for Tyler the Creator on Call Me If You Get Lost in 2021, with all of its luxuriant throwbacks to sounds of the 2000s that were adjacent to Justin Timberlake on the Gangsta Grillz mixtapes. And that's not surprising either. A lot of us are conditioned to buy into what are perceived as virtues in a capitalist worldview, celebrate the success stories by proxy because, hell, they're so opulent, maybe you could do it too. Look, my point here is less a damning critique of what Justin Timberlake did in trying to manufacture a brand of class and cool that rode on opulence and expensive taste. I get the fundamental appeal of it. It's not normally my thing, but I absolutely understand how it can work for an audience that is inspired by it. They want to luxuriate in the afterglow. I mean, it's hard to critique a desire for finer things on a base level, but I also want to show the dangerous risk that can come when that attitude falls out of step with society at large, or if that cool sense begins to crumble in your hands. What's kind of fascinating is that Justin Timberlake had every reason to believe that it would probably work, because in the cultural climate of the mid-2000s, It did. But in 2013, it was a year of massive upheaval. The 2000s allowed his plays for dominance to compound his social capital, whereas 2013 seemed built to challenge it. And in the years to come, we would see a backlash to even those challenges by people invested in those power structures. Justin Timberlake wasn't a part of that backlash, per se, but by Man of the Woods, it became abundantly clear how flimsy that veneer of cool really was. Now, some of that was rooted in bad ideas and his producer who was past his prime, or that maybe he was just a culture vulture the entire time and cribbing from a cool archetype of which he was no longer a part but sure as hell wanted to monetize. But either way, the seeds were planted for that 5 years earlier, and Justin Timberlake's music in the intervening time, from the grave robbery of Love Never Felt So Good and the gross virtual duet with the late Michael Jackson in 2014, to the utterly embarrassing Trolls soundtrack hit Can't Stop the Feeling in 2016, I mean, it doesn't seem like Justin Timberlake has ever grasped the point. But more importantly, as much as we've talked around the subjective frameworks of cool, where I could be wrong in all of this, you find an interesting double-edged sword. I mean, on the one hand, with the right capital and money behind it, one might be able to commodify a sense of cool in a certain subjective space, in a certain subjective time, and have quite the run trampling those in your wake, especially if the cultural climate is already in place to enable your systemic advantages, and you look good doing it. And I don't know, maybe it's worth examining some of those cycles of history so it doesn't allow that sort of exploitation that happened in the 2000s, that it doesn't echo forward, especially with Gen Z embracing much of the same irony as their parents did in the 90s and 2000s, and the underlying attitudes beginning to make their mark yet again. But should you choose to monetize your dominance and social capital in a moment and think that your newfound class is the relevant anchor point to secure your social relevance and power longer term, even just embracing it with a disavowal or irony and a practiced bit of distance might work for a time. Running on nostalgia for the fumes of history. No guarantee it's gonna last though. Your legacy might ring hollow without that earnest emotion or truth, and that's certainly not cool, but it might wind up sticking, resonating more than any passing trend. And in a moment when the lights are the most blinding, you might miss your chance to lay something that really sticks. And while cash and generational wealth will become its own insulation, of which I am sure many entertainers would be plenty happy to take and run, the social capital that's built on cool, that fosters a legacy, that can be a cursed treasure, leaving you to shamble as your light fades on the relevance in your career, still thinking you got all the answers as the world might pass you by. And suddenly, you're dancing in a hideous camo suit at the Super Bowl and watching your reputation implode in slow motion. In those moments where it seems like you've got all the power, you're on top of the world, it's often the most difficult to question it. Well, hey, hindsight's 2020, right?
Sometimes the greatest way to say something is to say nothing.
And there we have it. If you've all stuck around this long, thank you all so much for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I would be extremely grateful for all of it. Again, this is not meant to damn or praise Justin Timberlake, just kind of analyze his impact and where he was at a specific point in time and what worked and what may not have for longer term. And now Timberlake is going to be able to tour and be successful the majority of his career, even if many people think Man of the Woods is a career killer. Your career is only as dead as your next project, so if and when that drops, we will see what happens. I keep hearing rumors he's got something in the tank, we don't know. But in the meantime, in 2013, this is what he did. He was a major story, but one that kind of slipped between the radar, especially in recent years. You don't hear those albums get brought up much anymore. It's interesting to ponder why, and that's what this tried to do. Beyond that, though, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. If you guys want to get involved and help support the channel for I can make more insane, long-winded essays like this, link to my Patreon is right over there. Who knows, you may be able to get into my Discord and argue with me more directly. I'm sure that the comment sections are going to have a wealth of material. But until then, I'm Mark. You're watching Spectrum Pulse. I'll see you next time.